It's live already, eh? It's on Facebook.
Are we good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me, Professor Farid?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, let's get started then. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Africa for Palestine's talk today. My name is Alex, and I am a volunteer at Africa for Palestine, formerly known as BDS South Africa. Today, we are very privileged to have Professor Farid Esack, who is a South African Muslim liberation theologian and professor in the Department of Religion Studies at the University of Johannesburg. He currently serves on the board of Africa for Palestine. And the topic for today of our live webinar is Jerusalem and the myth of God as a deceitful real estate agent. That's a really wonderful title. I'm not sure who came up with that, if it was Professor Farid or folks at Africa for Palestine, but seems like really, really fascinating, interesting stuff. I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar. And before we jump in, I just want to quickly share for those who may be unaware or new to us. But Africa for Palestine is an organization that works on focusing and strengthening African-Palestinian relations and pushing back against apartheid Israel's infiltration and influence into the continent of Africa. Africa for Palestine works with solidarity groups, trade unions, political formations, and human rights organizations across the African continent who have our same spirit of progressive internationalism and commitment to standing with oppressed peoples all over the world. So with these intros in place and that being said, I would like to welcome Professor Farid Esack to begin his talk. The talk will be about a half hour to 45 minutes. We thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much to all the other comrades in Africa for Palestine. It's good to be here and to do this presentation. Well, first of all, in approaching any kind of topic, we are talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about claims to Jerusalem, and we're talking about well, basically what it comes down to is the whole idea of reducing God. In the title, I use the concept of God as a deceitful realtor or a deceitful real estate agent. But in a even more derogatory way, one can speak about God as a mascot for a soccer team or a rugby team, because God is the supporter of a particular team, and he's the mascot. He's not the big player really, but he represents the team and all the cuteness and the affection and so on that goes along for the team. And this is very, very evident in political Zionists' claims over not just Jerusalem, but what they describe as Greater Israel. So there are four different ways of looking at it. The one is the question of historical claims. The other one is the question of international law and universal human rights. And then there is, of course, the question of religious claims, and that's the most fascinating one for us today. The idea that God gave this to us. So those are the three approaches, Alex, that I will be adopting, okay? Now, if I may start with an overview of Jerusalem. It's one of the oldest cities of the world, one of the 3-4 oldest cities in the world. It's a city that is sacred to the three major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, historically the earliest, and then followed by Christianity, and then again historically Islam. I'm saying historically, and I'll come back to the word history, because Muslims generally believe that Islam is the path of submission to the will of God, and therefore all the other religions that preceded Islam. In many ways, their followers were also Muslims, not with a capital M, but in the literal sense of the word. Okay, so, but when I use the word historically as we understand it in history, not religiously. Of course, all of us know that Israel and the Palestinians and much of the global South claim Jerusalem as their capital. It's a city that has been destroyed at least twice. It has been besieged 23 times, captured and recaptured 45 times, and attacked 55 times. Lots of other old history and so on connected to the city, and much of this history is contested. More specifically, in the old part of the city, known as the Old City, it has been traditionally divided into 4 quarters since the early 19th century, known as the Armenian, the Christian, the Jewish, and the Muslim quarters. Jerusalem is home to a number of temple structures that are of deep religious significance for the adherents of these 3 religious groups. You have the Temple Mount with its western wall, which is very, very sacred for Jews. You have the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the place from where Muhammad is supposed to have ascended unto heavens. You have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site to where, according to Christians, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ had taken place. Today, of course, Jerusalem is one of the major issues in the tensions in the larger region, in what many people describe as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a term that I avoid because I've taken sides. I don't speak about husband-wife issues when the man beats the wife up. I don't speak about domestic dispute when the woman is being abused by the husband. I talk about domestic abuse, domestic violence. I talk about the husband beating up the wife. I don't say that they've got quarrels among themselves. So I don't speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, okay? In 1948, West Jerusalem was one of the areas captured and later annexed by Israel. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, was annexed by Jordan. And in 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem as well, and then subsequently annexed it into Jerusalem. And today, of course, it is recognized by Israel, only by Israel, and the United States of America, and possibly some small island vassal state of the US itself as the capital of Israel. So earlier on, I referred to the question of history. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at history. The one way of looking at history is history as understood by archaeologists, by historians, by people who go into and dig up and go into archives, ancient documents, and so on. The other is to look at your sacred texts and to describe that as history. So there is the conflation between what people call sacred history or confessional history on the one hand, and history as seen in the more scientific world. So when we talk about, but then even history as in the scientific world, there are narratives and there are narratives. If you look at South Africa's history, for example, in 1652, I think so, Jan van Riebeeck landed in the Cape. And the immediate next sentence is, oh, he landed in the Cape. So the one is you write it, Jan van Riebeeck founded the Cape. Historical fact is that he landed in the Cape. When you say he founded it, or he founded South Africa, wait. To find means, you know, a little a coin was lying there all the time. I didn't know it was there, and then I found it. The other thing is, by my finding it, the coin suddenly becomes significant. No, Africa was there. South Africa was there. It didn't have that name. No, the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape was there. The fact that it only gets legitimated because you, a white man, sets your foot there, doesn't mean that it wasn't there before. So it becomes, so even history and how it is framed gets contested early on.
So, sorry, Professor Farid, if I can possibly ask you a quick question.
Yes.
As someone who, I mean, really sharpened his teeth in an actual long-term anti-apartheid struggle, and as someone you know, committed to revealing the undersides of history, I mean, I just want to ask you, what's really at stake here when it comes to history?
You know, in this particular case, you have two contesting approaches to history.
Okay.
The Zionists insist that this drama is about the Jews. Their earlier suffering throughout history, and more particularly their suffering after the pogroms in Russia, and later the Nazi Holocaust, where, according to the best records that we have, more than 6 million Jews perished at the hands of the Nazis and their allies. But if we're going to start the story with God's promise to Abraham, as many of these Jews do, or into the biblical account of the period when King David and his son Solomon rule over it, then we get into some serious other issues. The whole myths where salvation history, the history of a conversation or a record between you and God, that history is now conflated with empirically verified histories. And now certain communities elevate their histories above others, and they use salvation history along with the side weapons that aren't spoken about, either the power of the pen of propaganda or the power of the gun. So this year, again, God becomes the flag bearer in an army, as I said earlier on, the mascot of a soccer team, but this time with a gun. So it's the pen and the gun, propaganda and armed, and now you're going to implement this will of God or this promise of God. So for many of them, in the words of another scholar, it's a dialogue between Jews and God. And this continued dialogue is the history of the Jews with the rest of the world as interested eavesdroppers. And this is where the problem is. So God, and the God that you believes in some ways that God is a God, a universal God, but far more important, in your texts and in the covenant, this God is really the God of your people. You can't possibly be an estate agent, if you want to be a decent one, that represents both the buyer and the seller. You can't be a mascot or a cheerleader for this soccer team and for the opposition. So this God is a God of a particular tribe and engages in conversations with this tribe, undertakes a promise with this particular tribe. And the only difficulty is this, that like Van Riebeeck, who landed in South Africa, when this land came, according to the white narrative of South African history, it was an eternal contestation between the British and the Dutch. The British and the Dutch, the British and the Dutch. And somewhere along the line, there were these kind of black Africans also, or the Khoi and the San, the indigenous people of the lands and so on, who kind of interfered, sometimes on this side, sometimes on that side. But the story is really a story between the British and the Dutch, and these are really awkward black Africans who are sides to this. Now, of course, in presenting the narrative, I must be very careful that I don't presume that Jews weren't inside that part of the land historically for as long as we know. Okay, so there were also Jews in that land, but not only Jews, various permutations of history with others, and neither was Judaism, by the way, existed in the same form as we know it now. There were very many different tribes and so on. It only becomes a more kind of a larger religion much later on. So when you are looking at it from the angle of the others, what Dimont describes as eavesdroppers, wait, black South Africans weren't eavesdroppers in this conversation that God had with the Afrikaners, and he promised them this land. So those committed to the liberation of the Palestinians, we see the crucible of dispossession as simply another form of colonialism. You may think that you are exceptional, but there's no difference really between you and Jan van Riebeeck, with the one difference, one exception, and this, one exception is that there were actually some white people, if you compare the narrative with Israel, that there were some white people who were also living inside South Africa. But the fact that there were some white people, and this is just a fact for the sake of argument.
Comparison, yes.
For comparison, the fact that there were some white people living in South Africa for a very long time, this doesn't now legitimate the entry of the entire Europe and an invitation to all white people all over the world who feel that they are being persecuted for whatever reason to come and make South Africa their home. Wait, inside South Africa, there may have been whites, hypothetically speaking, but inside South Africa, there were also other people. There were black people, there was the Khoi, there was the San, there was the Bantu people. So from my angle, this whole idea of claiming God and documents sent by God and comparing those documents to contemporary sale deeds, this is an anachronism in the age of universal human rights and self-determination. So I'm a theologian, and my own South African engagement in our country's liberation struggle has alerted me to the importance of considering how power, always historically conditioned, shapes theological thinking. So you can't come to me just with your religious views and say, God has promised me this. I connect my understanding of how power merges. I connect this with religious thinking, and then I see how does this work towards the creation of a more just world. So
sure, Professor Esack, that's a lot to chew on. And if we're understanding you correctly, is what you're saying that, look, the study of history is important. We can go back and always show how there are these conflicts between different peoples. But when we are in the midst of history, especially when it comes to the context of apartheid Israel, occupied Palestine, or apartheid South Africa, are you also saying that in addition to studying history, we must also ask ethical and political questions in making history? Would that be a good understanding of what you're getting at?
Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, yes. It's not just, but it's not, I mean, if you're trying to suggest that I'm saying that it is simply history, first of all, I'm saying that the idea of sacred history trumping history as we understand it, that's just not going to work. A conversation that you have in private with your God, that I have another conversation in private with my God, there's no ways that we can resolve this. The only way that we can resolve this is in terms of a common language. And a common language, and this common language that we have, these are universal ethics, these are universal human rights, and these are international law. We can't, in terms of resolving territorial things. But if I may, just look at the question of where God comes into all of this. So in the Hebrew Bible, of course, Abraham, born into a household of idolaters in Mesopotamia, he's commanded by God to go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. In return, God promised, and I quote, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that's interesting. So Abraham becomes the key figure. God's enemies, Abraham's enemies becomes God's enemies. So now, the first response, when you look at the question of legitimation, there's an indigenous community in Palestine. So how does this now translate into the test between text and the test between rights? Now, the Hebrew Bible, we must, okay, let's not go into all of those stuff, the Hebrew Bible. But in our age of multiple discourses, we have to listen to varied angles of a story. And in fairness, the Jews also have a story to tell.
Yes.
In the same way, but the two things that we must be clear about, this essentializing of a people is just not on in our day and age and with our ethics. When you say the Jews and you talk about all the Jews under the sun, this is crazy. This is at the heart of racism. Oh, the only Jew that you find is a dead Jew. This is racism. Or all Jews are good people, or all Jews are oppressed throughout the world, or women are incapable of doing anything wrong. This kind of bland generalization, it leads to terrible crimes against other people. However, we have to consider the stories of the marginalized. And it's not simply saying, oh, all of us must take joint responsibility for the resolution of conflicts, blah, blah, blah. In many cases, the conversations that we want to participate in is literally between a David and a Goliath. And you can't approach a David and a Goliath even-handedly. In such situation, the primary responsibility for justice and peace is to give preferential treatment to the accounts of those who have suffered as a first step in the process of healing. So then you come to the question of, oh, so haven't the Jews suffered? Yes, of course. Yes, of course. And when I say the Jews have suffered, like the Black Africans have suffered, I'm not saying that they've suffered in the same ways, although, of course, if you look at the Belgians and their crimes, in the Congo under Leopold, there are certainly lots of connections between the suffering of the Jews, particularly if you talk about the Nazi Holocaust and so on. So there's always suffering. But what we need to ask, what are the forces of history and whose interest of race, class, and gender decides that the narrative of one group must be centered above all other narratives? And that reduces in what this demon that I had cited earlier on, reduces all of humankind to just interested eavesdroppers. So the question of suffering, the question of Jewish suffering is indisputable. The question is, how do you elevate the suffering of one people over all other people? You know, this slogan that emerged after the Second World War, where people said, never again. And never again, it is very appropriate, but never again must never mean never again to me, never again to us. When humankind are so interconnected with each other, and never again to me must also mean a never again to any of the other. Now, I don't know, you know, is there an interrupting question that you want to ask me, Alex, before I go on and tell a relatively longish story, but that really captures the myth of God as a deceitful real estate agent?
No, go ahead, Prof. Esack. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, some years ago, I went to visit, I visited friends at Notre Dame University in South Bend in Indiana. The school's football team, known as the Irish, they were playing against their ancient and nearby rivals, Purdue. Now, in many of the United States cities, you have two universities in the same cities. It's like the Ikes and the Martis in Cape Town. And they're forever, you know, in a semi-state of war with each other. So here in South Bend, Indiana, it was Notre Dame University and their rivals, Purdue. The match is always accompanied by a lot of fanfare. There are thousands of family, former students, fans who come from all over America. About 3 hours before kickoff, in the heart of this center of Roman Catholic scholarly excellence, Notre Dame University, I stood outside the back door of a basilica. A basilica is a small churchy temple structure, very small. So this was the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, and a large crowd had gathered, very peculiar to Catholicism, by the way. Outside the basilica, there was a long line of honor, people, fans standing neatly that snaked its way from the basilica right to the stadium, and they were standing there forming a line of honor in order to receive the Irish. Okay, as the Irish, and this is the nickname for the Notre Dame team, and of course Irish, also a Catholic country, Catholic state, and so on. So you see the connection between being Irish and Catholic and so on. Although of course many of them were black in some. Okay, yeah, as often many of the Zionists argue, but oh, can't be racist. Look at all these blacks amongst us. Look at these Ethiopians. We even have an Ethiopian minister in this very, very long, huge cabinet that Netanyahu has just unveiled. So the Irish emerged from the basilica where they had attended a special mass. And in the mass, of course, they prayed for God to give them victory over Purdue today. Here they walked, serious looking, well-dressed as business executives, and the crowd were oohing and eyeing, awestruck as they made their way over to the stadium. And the crowd just looked at them, kind of venerating in silence, perfect silence. It was like a ceremony that was going on. Many of the spectators, they tried to shake the hands of the players, but the players were in another world. They were concentrating, they were focusing. They've got God behind them and God in front of them, by the way. And the spectators, as the players were passing them, silently, reverentially, they all made the sign of the cross as they passed by. A few minutes later, tucked behind the building next to the basilica, I saw more fans, but these fans were kneeling and making the sign of the cross before or after lighting a candle in front of the statue of the Virgin of Mary in this little grotto, what was called Our Lady of Lourdes Grotto, connected to Catholic miracles that happened in France. And now I wondered whether these athletes had also come here before their special mass in the basilica. What I did discover a few hours later, that a few minutes before kickoff, many of them did take the time upon racing into the stadium to first run to the other end of the field. They knelt, said a last prayer, they hastily made the sign of the cross, but in front of a massive portrait of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was standing like this with open arms. And throughout the United States, this huge mosaic on a 10-story high wall, it is actually known as Touchdown Jesus. And so here you have Jesus keeping a watchful eye over the Irish at every home game. But there were two other rituals. The bookshop of the university, turned into a souvenir shop now, was packed to full capacity. Hundreds of shoppers going for everything, from rosaries to sweatshirts to postcards. The second ritual was less crowded, but that ritual involved stopping next door at the alumni office to renew your commitment to the flock, this chosen flock that God has blessed. And really, it appeared to me that God, in the divine attributes of Jesus of Nazareth, already probably a Catholic, was being reduced, or in this heresy that was going on, to a Notre Dame mascot. I was struck by all of this. I quite frankly didn't know whether to treat this as a bloody joke or to act all reverential towards whatever meaning all of this gave to all the Notre Dame Irish devotees. And not inconsequential. In the middle of all of this stuff, God's promise to the Irish, the Notre Dame players, that's seemingly the big game. But there was another show going on, as I indicated earlier on. There was a lot of money to be made by Notre Dame that day, or to be dispensed by their devotees. And I couldn't help but thinking that regardless of the depth of the religious fervor demonstrated by all these true believers, these rituals and the Catholic religious symbols were all being co-opted into the financial dynamics beyond the famous institutions of higher learning. The sacred was being co-opted by the secular. And this secular was deeply wedded to sectarian and financial interests. Notre Dame's God was an Irish fan, and a very wealthy one too, and he hates Purdue. And here you can see the connections that I'm making. So in the middle of all of this, God is on our side. God gave us, he blessed us in the grotto there earlier on. God is present on the field there. He is our God. And by the way, there's this funny thing that they do. Whenever the Irish or the Notre Dame guys, when they score, they run across very quickly to the to touchdown Jesus. They touch the wall and then they're back on the field. Oh, and this God, he actually hates Purdue. He must be hating Purdue because he is desperate for the Irish to win. So these are the founding myths that people have and create. But founding myths aren't just beliefs to be respected. The founding myth of Afrikanerdom, that God gave us this land. We had the song of the flag in South Africa that we had to sing dutifully under apartheid, uitgegee op gesag van die hoogste se hand, given to us on the authority of the highest, the most elevated, the supreme, meaning this land given to us by God. So Afrikanerdom had its religious myths, and people may deeply right-wing Afrikaners may be offended that I'm comparing their myths to the myths of the Irish in Notre Dame there in South Bend, Indiana. Other people have their myths too, man. The Afrikaners had their myths. The Maasai of Kenya had their myths. The Ulstermen in Northern Ireland, the Serbs in former Yugoslavia. Why should their myths, I mean, the Maasai, for example, believed that, that they were the guardians of all the cattle in the world. So the colonialists came and accused them of stealing cattle. No, God had given us these cattle. Why should these colonials come and own cattle? So we need to ask, what is it that elevates the Zionist foundational myths above others? And that means that their myths are beyond critical scrutiny. What process of history involving power and the powerful changes the myths of some people into folklore? Oh, these are interesting stories about how the Maasai looked at themselves. Oh my God, how could these Afrikaners get away with this fascinating but arrogant presumption that God gave them this part of the land? In how the hell did they get away with it? So that we can scrutinize. But other myths can't be scrutinized. And normally, critical thinking scholars, you must tiptoe around these myths. It's like, you know, you can speak about everything under the sun, but oh my God, don't touch the Zionist myths, because now, it's like anti-Semitism and so on. So are we frozen in ahistorical identities? Or do our identities change? And it's not so much often what happened to us, but who manipulates what happens to us in order, or manipulates the narrative in order to increase their own power. And in this particular things, I don't think that the myth of chosenness had different evolutions throughout history, but today it very conveniently fits in with white supremacism, the collusion of the United States on the one hand, and on the other hand, Europe's inability to seriously deal with its crimes of anti-Semitism, and how anti-Semitism and the Jew as evil has so permeated its history since the New Testament, never interested in resolving those questions, just dump it off onto another people, and we don't care, you know, if the Palestinians exist or if they don't exist, but this is a small price to pay. If I may just conclude, Alex, on this, on a little story.
That's perfect, fine, Prof. Esack.
Gary Berger, sorry, did I miss you? I just want to.
Yes, that's perfectly fine, Prof. Esack. We were supposed to stop around this time, but you can have at least another 5 minutes. We should be fine.
Okay, so Gary Berger, a New Testament scholar, he gives a fascinating story of a conversation that he had in 1990 with two teenage boys from a nearby Jewish settlement in Jerusalem. Because Christian Palestinians were protesting the theft of church property by the Zionists. And Gary Berger was there. He's a New Testament scholar, and he was pretending to be this neutral guy, just interested in talking to these young Zionist or Jewish kids. The boys, he says, were eager to explain their fairly simple arguments to a tourist. We've bought this land, what is ours anyway, and how we did it doesn't matter, they said. I asked, is it not true that the Greek Orthodox Church had owned this property for 100, possibly even thousands of years? It doesn't matter, they answered. God gave us this country and this city, and Jews can live anywhere. We're only talking about what is ours by right. These people have no right even to be in the city. And then Gary Berger says, the last thought enticed me. I pursued the idea of rights with these 17-year-old zealots. God gave this land to Abraham, and we are his descendants. It belongs to us. Everything that happened in between simply doesn't matter. The Palestinian Christians should just get out. And then he says, the conversation struck me as odd because these boys were American. They were from New York, and they had been in the country for only a few years. And so the point is that regardless of the intensity of Zionist belief in the chosenness of the Jewish people, the historical truth is that other communities have also laid claims to chosenness. There is nothing unique about this, about Zionist claims. The only astonishing aspect in the case of Zionism is the extent to which otherwise intelligent and sensitive people can so yeedly proceed from the uncritical assumption of this uniqueness. So the bottom line is the Bible is invoked as a deed of ownership by ideologues who don't even believe in its divine authorship. It's like, most of the listeners would probably know that believing in the Torah as a text from God, or even believing in God, is not a condition for being a Jew. And many of the earlier Zionists, by the way, were avowed atheists. So there is no God, but the promise of God is good enough. God does not really exist, but he is nonetheless able to be a dishonest real estate agent who passes out his land to his favorites. Land with borders clearly demarcated, as if they were registered in the 21st century title deeds, all at the same time, at a time when thousands of years ago, national boundaries were rather unknown. And in the face of this patent absurdity, self-respecting academics, otherwise critical scholars, journalists, and public figures, we pretend that we have to play along. So to conclude, Alex, in the end, if we really want to resolve issues amongst people, there are principles of justice and injustice. There are lenses through which you look at a problem. And I, as a South African that have been a part of our country's liberation struggle, I prefer to look at this through the lenses of the marginalized and the oppressed, people who have lived there and shared the land with Jews for centuries. And Jews in this case means people who live there, not every single European, not every single person from the United States who has a religious identity and then claims all of us can make, but claims at the disposition of other people with equally and even more legitimate claims, that is not acceptable in a world wherein we really respect human rights. Let me end there.
Mm. Wow, Professor Esack, you really gave us a lot to chew on. I think myself and many of our viewers greatly benefited from the history, the tools of analysis, the deeper ethical, moral, and political questions you raised. Yeah, I sure learned a lot, and we at Africa for Palestine would like to thank you dearly for your time, for your commitment, of course, to the Palestine solidarity movement and the liberation of Palestine, of Palestinians, and as I think, as you mentioned, of Israelis and those who support apartheid Israel, who as oppressors in their own right are stuck. And also need to find a way out of this wretched system they've created. So yeah, thank you very much, Professor Farid Esack. We really appreciate your time. That was a wonderful lecture, and we really appreciate the webinar. If I can just share with viewers, so we were very lucky to have Professor Esack today. But we actually, this is the inaugural, this is the first webinar with Professor Farid Esack, and he will actually be continuing every Wednesday going forward for the next, is it 3 or 4 weeks, Professor Esack?
It's 4 or 5.
4 or 5, okay, sorry. For the next 4 to 5 weeks, Professor Farid Esack will be live streaming a webinar on the Africa for Palestine Facebook page. The same way you access the webinar right now today, you can continue to access every Wednesday at 7 p.m. South African time. Is it 7, Prof, or is it's 5 p.m.?
The different times are somewhere, yes.
You know, I think it may be 5 p.m. South African time, but I encourage viewers to check out social media.
No, it is 4 o'clock South Africa time, 16 hours South Africa time, 17 hours Palestine time, 10 hours Eastern Standard Time, and 19:30 Kashmir time.
Oh, wow. So we're really all over the place. That's wonderful. Okay. So we encourage, our supporters and viewers to continue to tune in with the wonderful Professor Farid Esack. So I would just like to thank Professor Farid Esack one more time. And now we have just 2 last announcements. We were supposed to have, Africa for Palestine was supposed to have a webinar at 3 p.m. today with Comrade Dudu, who is a member of the South African Council for Churches and a member of the board of Africa for Palestine, who was going to do a webinar on the plight of Palestinian Christians. Unfortunately, we had technical difficulties, as I'm sure many people are experiencing now with Zoom trialing and Zoom trials and tribulations. So we apologize for those technical difficulties, and we will alert our supporters very soon as to when that webinar will be redone. Next, we would just like to remind folks as well that we are currently selling essential items. This baby right here, Africa for Palestine produced Kuffiel face masks. These are really, really great, high quality, very comfortable too, face masks that the manufacturing is done here all in South Africa with the Kuffiel, this traditional Palestinian scarf that you see here. this material actually coming straight from Palestine. So you are supporting Palestinians as well as the local South African economy by buying these masks. You can find more information on purchasing them on our social media. And yeah, please continue to follow us on social media, spread the word, and continue to struggle in the long-term struggle, and hopefully shorter than longer, to end Israeli apartheid. Thank you all very much. Amandla, Free Palestine.